maybe we'll just toss these papers aside and have an extended commentary on the last panel, since a lot of what we're going to say is going to be either in contradiction to what Emery said, or at least expose other parts of it. So thanks for having me here, everyone. One word of warning, and that is that my paper is not the briefest thing you may have ever come across in the history of your existence. Originally, I planned something larger. I intended on cutting it down. I cut parts of it. But it's a little bit more than 5 minutes long. So if you need to get up and stretch your legs during it or something, you're very welcome to do so. Let me begin with a self-plug, if such a thing exists. And that is, as was mentioned a few minutes ago, I did a lot of my research for a number of different pieces, but most importantly my dissertation, which became my first book, here in South Carolina, a number of other archives as well, the old South Carolina Department of Archives and History. And it was published in 1996 by the University of South Carolina Press. But there's a very big difference between my dissertation and the book that was published and got reprinted later. But quite a big difference, and it's rather ironic. The original manuscript, the original dissertation, was called People's War in South Carolina. I mean, it was a study of insurgency and counterinsurgency after the American Civil War. This is where people like Walter have to cut their ears. The USC Press looked at it and said, "This is ridiculous. Who cares about insurgency? Rewrite the entire thing, or we won't publish it." There's no interest in insurgency. There's no interest in terrorism. There's no interest in counterinsurgency. There's no market for that. Can you make it a little more political, a little more, classic, contemporary, sort of traditional history? So I spent a lot of time basically recasting the entire study so that it wasn't about insurgency and counterinsurgency. And then Captain Lee calls me out of the blue and says, "Hey, can you do a paper on insurgency or counterinsurgency?" So I feel vindicated somehow that the original manuscript is coming back to light. The way I want to portray this, in contradistinction to what Dr. Thomas sort of looked at, is sort of Revolution Redux, People's War in Reconstruction, South Carolina. The approach I'm going to take here in my paper is relatively strategic. It's not very tactical. Those of you who are looking for, intense, glorified, detailed stories of interesting characters jumping out from behind bushes or something like that, that's not how I wanted to approach it. I wanted to take it to a higher level and sort of explore the entire South Carolina Reconstruction history as insurgency, as an attempt by a local indigenous population to overthrow a new social political system imposed upon them, classic insurgency. So when I look at South Carolina during this period, I see sort of 4 phases of this insurgency. The first phase I call a window of accommodation. It begins immediately after the war. The second phase I call immature insurgency, or insurgency without revolution. That begins in about 1868, and I take it through about late summer of 1872. That leads into a third phase, which I call the PTO phase. Those of you who are coin enthusiasts and tend to wear different uniforms love acronyms, and I use the PTO when I study insurgency. PTO means patience, time, and organization. And then in about late 1875, about December of 1875, is when we actually enter mature revolutionary insurgency. So, first, my window of accommodation. As in the aftermath of many civil conflicts, confusion, dislocation, uncertainty followed in the wake of civil war. Nonetheless, 1865 through about the spring of 1867 marked a period of possible accommodation, which, as we know, never really materialized. Freed people would not accommodate restrictions on their freedom. Southern whites refused to accommodate the desires of African Americans, or even accommodate the spirit of Union victory. President Andrew Johnson rejected accommodation with congressional moderates. And of course, congressional Republicans refused to accommodate white Southerners, or Johnson's defense of white Southerners. Some of you may have seen the most recent biography on Andrew Johnson by Annette Gordon-Reed, who really saw Reconstruction full of opportunities, spoiled by this sort of troglodyte Neanderthal conservative racist. I think that's a misreading. What I see in Reconstruction is intractable positions. What I see in Reconstruction is not much opportunity. What I see in Reconstruction are immovable forces, or I should say maybe immovable obstacles and unresistible forces colliding. This collision, as most of you probably know, brings out what we call congressional or radical Reconstruction. In the March of 1867, Republicans in Congress embarked on a program to coerce former Confederate states into a system of compliance. Military Reconstruction Acts, 14th Amendment, ultimately the 15th Amendment, radically transformed the political, social, constitutional, legal, and economic landscape of the South. By the fall of '67, facing a tidal wave of these political and social changes, conservative white Carolinians attempted to forestall this new Republican agenda by preventing a state convention that would have ushered in this new government. They demonstrated considerable organizational skill in opposing the convention, but the referendum succeeded, the convention met, and by the spring of '68, South Carolina had a new General Assembly, a new Constitution, had been readmitted to the Union, and that summer had a new governor, a guy by the name of Robert Kingston Scott, a Yankee general from Ohio. The reaction to this Republican government was swift and, as many people have said, predictable. My point is, the reaction will not be coherent, it will not be thorough, and as a result, what I call, it comes to an immature insurgency, or an insurgency without revolution. Republican Reconstruction displaced local white Democrats in favor of Northern Republicans and African Americans. Granted political power, civil rights to African Americans, many of them former slaves. Disfranchised former leaders, imposed new tax structures inimical to white landowners and yeomen, and ushered in, like it or not, an orgy of graft and corruption that bolstered conservatives' claims to moral superiority. The situation represented the antithesis of the Confederacy's goals. These had included slavery, white supremacy, republicanism, state sovereignty, all under the genteel guidance of a native white planter gentry. One of my favorite insurgency coin scholars, Ekwet Akbal, was very, very prolific studying on the ground insurgencies in the 60s and 70s. He calls this triple dislocation, telescoped triple dislocation. Complete dislocation of political, social, and economic power occurring in a very small time. That is South Carolina. It's during this time we see the first Ku Klux bands begin to appear. Historians still debate the motives of the Ku Klux at this time, but most research, including my own, indicates that politics were the primary driver. And the Ku Klux was quite simply a paramilitary organization, the military arm of the Democratic Party in South Carolina. By April, reports of Ku Klux activity were appearing in scores of papers. Reports from Freedmen's Bureau agents, local Republicans, state constables, all confirmed some sort of paramilitary organization with secret cells, a capable intelligence system, a functioning communication network had established itself across the South Carolina country. By the summer of '68, violence was on the increase. It had changed from midnight visits, arsons, warnings, to daylight attacks, mass attacks, even daylight assassinations. Klan activity was no longer limited to the upcountry. by the summer and late summer, meetings, attacks, and threats occurred in Central and Southern as well. As the fall approached and an election of 1868 approached, politically motivated violence was so prevalent that this new governor, this Republican governor, Robert Scott, actually held a session to discuss moving the capital to Charleston. It is my intention, the governor said, to have the legislature meet in Charleston in November. We can have our backs to the sea. If we are forced to defend our lives, we will make it war. And it'll be the most terrible war these scoundrels have ever seen. This was, obviously, hyperbole. Okay? For instance, one question should come to mind. If this governor's going to fight this war, what's he going to fight it with? Right? Some recommended the governor declare martial law. Others said he should arm African Americans. Still others said hire northern mercenaries. There's lots of cheap immigrant labor up there. Bring them down. Right? That'll do the trick. Scott alluded to all of these in something that I heard earlier in a session this morning in playing sort of a carrot-stick policy. Right? What Scott started doing in late '68 was meeting with conservative, white, former Confederate leadership. Right? He met with the Democratic State Committee. He had several private meetings with the now famous Wade Hampton III, and he warned of growing federal activity. He warned of plans to arm South Carolina African Americans. He even hinted at ideas about hiring sort of Yankees from Union veterans to have them come into the South. This bluff seemed to do the trick. By October and November, leading newspapers were calling for an end to the violence. Postings were signed by leading conservative Democrats, including every member of the state committee and Wade Hampton. By the end of October and in the first week of November, Scott published a series of official proclamations thanking Carolinians for their efforts in promoting peace. Now, it is unclear why violence abated. The state had no real police force to speak of. There's no evidence the federal government was planning on doing anything. But the '68 election passed relatively quietly. Did the bluff work? Or did Ku Klux, whatever leadership it may have had, realize that the risks were coming too high, decided to ratchet back some of the action? Regardless, as most of you probably know, U.S. Grant was elected president in 1868 by a margin that really bespoke the importance of the African American vote. Those of you who looked at the election counts realize how important the enfranchised vote became at that point. Grant and the Republicans also carried South Carolina. Whatever harm, whatever damage the Ku Klux hoped to do, it had failed. It had failed. Why had it failed? Why did it have so little effect on the election? Local terrorism was quite effective. Okay, local assaults, local sort of tactical aspects were very, very effective. But the '68 Ku Klux was purely negative in its agenda. Okay? It opposed the Republican platform, but it didn't promote any alternative. Right? You can go back, in fact, earlier I heard things I'd never hear anywhere else, like Jeff Davis as Mao, sort of thing. But it's an interesting example. I mean, Mao himself wrote extensively about no effort to overthrow foreign invaders will work unless you have an alternative. Okay? You must possess a clear political agenda. You must have a valid call to moral superiority. You must promise a better life. Okay? In other words, it's what some scholars call, you must have a parallel hierarchy. Okay? It's not enough just to be negative. You have to have something positive to take its place. Okay? In '68, this original Ku Klux presented nothing of that. It was an immature insurgency. It was only negative in its response to Republican rule. Unfortunately, at the time, for white and black South Carolina Republicans, violence reappeared after the election. And it increased dramatically as '68 became 1869. Flurries of letters and petitions to the governor, to state constables, stories of assassinations, night visits, and a lot of information, internal and external, about new Ku Klux Klans being created. As in the year previous, the governor began examining options to quell what he saw as rising violence, especially in the upcountry. But in 1869, something had changed. A lot of things had changed. For one thing, now Congress was completely under the control of the Republican Party, including the presidency. The 15th Amendment had been completely ratified, so the Military Reconstruction Acts were being used for enfranchising the African American vote before. Now it was being done under the 15th Amendment. And a little-known law passed right after the war had been taken off the books. Right? Just after the war, Congress passed a law prohibiting state militias. Right? In 1869, right, that was repealed. Right? So states could begin forming their own militias. Very quickly, South Carolina Republicans took advantage of that. In March, Scott applied to Washington for funding and for ordinance to equip a new state militia. Males from 18 to 45 were invited to join, but most Democrats rejected the idea. As a result, Republicans, mostly African Americans, dominated this new militia. Now, those of you who study counterinsurgency, insurgency, counterinsurgency, this looks like a page out of some of the best counterinsurgency approaches. And that is using local forces, recruiting local forces to create security and stability. That was not the case in 1869 in South Carolina. Creating a Republican African-American militia was like throwing gasoline on the fire. So instead of helping this situation, what we start to get into, and you could see this in other discussions yesterday and today, particularly in South Carolina with Dr. Edgar, the idea of David Kilcullen's accidental guerrilla. Those of you who are familiar with the accidental guerrilla, that there are a great many people on the fence, but they can tilt either way. One of the things I find abhorrent about the movie The Patriot that was discussed earlier with Mel Gibson is there's nothing patriotic in it. Okay, I find it as a real misnomer. What drives Mel Gibson to be an insurgent is vindication of honor, atrocities to his family, his personal fortune, his kin. It is very personal for him. All the silly flag waving that occurs in that film is rather ridiculous. There's very little spirit of patriotism or nationalism, in my opinion. This is what happens in South Carolina in 1869. That in an effort to quell violence, the creation of this militia increases the violence. Okay? You actually see more and more Ku Klux bands forming, and it is at this point in 1869 you see the first rifle clubs and saber clubs forming, largely in reaction to the Republican state militia. South Carolina Republicans were dealt yet another blow, okay, not just rising violence and more sort of paramilitary groups, but in late 69, early 70, it became clear that the Republican Party was splitting in the state. In 1870, Robert Scott ran for re-election, and the party split over that, and many of the bolters tried to seek an alliance with Democratic conservatives, tried to seek an uneasy alliance. They called themselves the Union Reform Party, running for the governorship and state assembly in 1870. Lieutenant governor was none other than General M.C. Butler, Matthew Calvin Butler. This wouldn't be enough. Okay? Still puts us in that phase of immature insurgency. We do have localized terrorism and violence, and now we do have an attempt at a political agenda. But the fact is, this is still a Republican political agenda. Sort of, slathering on a little bit of Confederacy on it was not a parallel hierarchy. The 1870 election did not present an alternative for white South Carolinians. Right? You chose either the regular Republican Party or this offshoot, sort of bolting Republican Party. There still was no real alternative. So as a result, the Republican Party held control. Robert Kingston Scott was re-elected from Ohio, was re-elected, and it's sort of strike two for the Ku Klux in their efforts to really change the political dynamics in the state. Repeat, once again, after the election, violence increases. Right? So by late 70 and early 71, you actually have some of the most violent incidents by Ku Klux bands in the entire South during Reconstruction. We have the taking of entire cities, I should say towns, that are under siege, more and more calls for help coming into state constabularies, coming into the nascent system of the African-American militia and the state militia. Violence is on the rise, and so, once again, since these things are repeating, Robert Kingston Scott does the same, as he did back in 68, 69. Carrot and stick. Carrot and stick. This time, his carrot was tastier? I don't know. What's a metaphorical carrot? Once again, Scott visited with what he saw as the leadership of some of this sort of paramilitary activity. He met with the State Democratic Party, met with leading conservatives in and out of politics, and again, sought to leverage what he had. Even, one of his carrots was even disbanding many of the African-American militia units. A lot of them had to stack their arms, a lot of them had to send their arms to Columbia or Charleston. They were still on the rolls on paper, but he was willing to compromise in some ways, a larger carrot, if you will. He also had a larger stick, whereas back 2 years earlier, he had threatened all kinds of things would happen. This time, things were happening. By the spring of 1871, U.S. Army units had begun moving into the state, elements of the 19th Infantry, elements of the 9th Infantry, and elements of the 7th Cavalry began moving into the state. South Carolina was becoming sort of a model for how the government may end up enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendment. One such unit, the 7th Cavalry under Lewis Merrill, my friend Stephen's going to talk about in more detail in a little bit. But other sticks were developing as well. By April, Congress, in April of 1871, Congress passed the third of its enforcement acts, which allowed the president to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And that same summer, the Joint Congressional Committee to inquire into conditions of affairs in the late insurrectionary states was visiting South Carolina, collecting data, doing interviews, collecting testimonies on violence in the South. By late spring, newspapers were already calling for peace. Right? By summer, the State Democratic Party was issuing calls for peace and tranquility. Okay? One newspaper even called for even raised a warning voice. Please, force, if persisted in, will be suppressed by the power of the federal government. Right? So both the carrot and the stick seem to be having an effect. Every record I could find, every indication, I've got all kinds of charts and tables and all this other mumbo-jumbo, shows that Ku Klux activity by the middle of the summer was diminishing, and by late summer was almost completely gone. Okay? We have journals, we have diaries, both from Army units in the state and personal collections from conservative members showing that even in the most dangerous areas, York, Lawrence, these kinds of counties, things were getting quieter and quieter and quieter. One name you may recognize from your Western history studies, a fellow by the name of Marcus Reno from the 7th Cavalry is in South Carolina. And he attributes the decline in violence to, quote, the active part taken by men of property, showing the folly of such deeds and the harm it will bring South Carolina. As most of you probably know, if you study your South Carolina history, the decline in violence didn't prevent further federal activity. Right? In October, when it really seemed like South Carolina was largely at peace, Congress and the Grant administration decided to make an example of South Carolina. A lot of the literature refers to this as the crackdown. Thanks to affairs occurring on the other side of the world, we now have a new word for it. We can call it the surge. Right? A surge occurred in South Carolina. President Grant suspended the habeas corpus in 9 upcountry counties. Federal agents from the new Justice Department swept in using Army units as posse comitatus, swept through the state, arrested hundreds of suspected Klansmen, and scores of others fled to as far as Canada. In a matter of weeks, jails and makeshift holding pens were bulging with hundreds of suspects. By November, federal trials began here in Columbia. Now, the focus here is insurgency, really, not counterinsurgency, but two little quick remarks that'll develop later in the second paper. One is, I hold a very unsympathetic view of the surge. I don't think it did much. I actually think it did more harm than good. There was very little support activity for it, very little planning done in it, and as a result, it showed a lot of weaknesses in the federal enforcement effort, rather than showing that there would be sustained enforcement activity. I really think it hurt more than it helped. Here's a letter from the district attorney, the prosecuting attorney, to the boss, to the district attorney, from the district attorney to the AG, Attorney General in Washington. I have significant information showing that orders have been given to stop the violence for the present. The dens, the organizations, and the groups will then wait out events until the storm blows over and then resume operations. Okay? Classic insurgency activity. Okay? Going underground, going into sleep mode, going into pause mode until the storm blows over, coming back. This guy's saying exactly this in 1872. Second observation, real quick observation, is I think the federal enforcement effort failed for the same reason the Ku Klux effort failed. Right? The federal enforcement effort was tactically driven, extraordinarily successful. Hundreds of people arrested. Intelligence activities, I mean, the job went well. But there was no sustainability. There was no plan for the trials. There was no concept of how these things would actually be handled in court. There was even no idea where these people were going to be held. There was, in other words, no real larger political agenda, more larger structure and context into which this fit. It was too ad hoc, too impromptu. Okay? Just like the Ku Klux activity. Okay? Very effective to the individuals assaulted, but the larger context missing, it doesn't really have the political clout to change the dynamics of the state. This brings us to my third phase, my PTO phase, which I start at about the end of '72, just after the surge, and I take it to the end of '75. PTO is planning, time, or actually patience, time, and organization. State conservatives, I must say, exhibited extraordinary patience following the surge. Okay? The election, the next national and state election, the election of 1872, was the calmest, quietest election probably since before the Civil War. Right? Just one quip from an Edgefield paper right before that election. Okay? The headline was "A Warning to Southern Men." Right? Please avoid anything that might inflame old wounds and provoke undue attention. I mean, there's an overt cognizance here that we didn't give up and we weren't beaten. Okay? We're just waiting. We're just waiting. Okay? White conservatives in the state really did show an ability to learn from their mistakes. The key to revolution, the key to a successful insurgency is organization. A line from the Winsburg News. The undisciplined mass, if it succeeds, cannot reap the fruits of triumph, and if it fails, it becomes hopelessly demoralized. What we need is an organized body. What we need is something undismayed by disaster. It must be sustained by discipline and by the knowledge that if it perseveres, it will win. Through 1873 and 1874, Carolinians reflected on a range of tools for this organization. Okay? In 1874, we start seeing the first serious taxpayers conventions, where groups of conservatives would gather together not just discuss the economics of the state and the tax structures of the state, but to discuss, in reality, ways to retake political control. Right? Some of these ways sound pretty banal. Okay? One piece of advice was, let's make such combinations outside the domain of peace that will topple the Republican government. That, I mean, sounds great, but it's kind of floozy. Right? William Dunlop Porter had a really imaginative approach, and that was, all right, let's go send agents to Germany and to New York to recruit whites to vote in the state. If you bring in enough immigrants, they can turn the balance of the vote in close counties, and we can retake the state under normal voting circumstances without violence. Kind of interesting. I like that. Perhaps the most important organizational tool during this period, and probably the most famous, was the Rifle Club. Okay. Now, as I said, as soon as the first Republican militia units were formed, rifle clubs started appearing, and certainly in the famous campaign of '76, they'll be dropping from the trees like oranges. But it is really in the period 73-74 where you begin to see the Rifle Club or the Sable Club as an organizational element. Right? This is sort of, I call it the eureka moment. State leaders realized they could create an overt, extra-legal, paramilitary entity, right, capable of physical and economic intimidation, carrying a statewide presence, serving a vast communication network. Okay, these were revolutionary cells. Okay? But at the same time, they could be used both publicly, unlike, say, the Ku Klux could, because they were social clubs, and that way you wouldn't incur external wrath. Hardly a day passed without seeing reports in papers about these clubs. I have an example here from one day, in Charleston News and Courier, March 7th, 1873. Three different stories about three different clubs. The Sumter Rifle Club was having an election. The German Rifles were picking new uniforms. And the Palmetto Rifle Guard was arranging a shooting match. With these paramilitary groups proliferating across the state, not just in the upcountry, South Carolina Republicans again looked for some recourse. It was clear the African American militia, the Republican militia, was not the right tool. Yet, in 1874, the state created, through the Assembly, created an authorization bill which allowed for a new form of militia. In other words, parallel to the existing one. This wouldn't be a state militia. It wouldn't be funded or supplied by the state. It would simply be, quote unquote, groups of men organized for private military organizations. Once again, those of you who study COIN, this is very classic. You see this in Counterinsurgency Manual 3 TAC 24 today. Very often counterinsurgency measures mimic insurgency measures. The insurgents are creating paramilitary groups. Let's create paramilitary groups. There's a lot of mirroring going on. But again, we fall into that accidental guerrilla idea of David Kilcullen, and that is this extrapolatory effect, this spiral effect. By late 73, early 74, the creation of these gun clubs takes on an accelerated pace, and their tone changes significantly. You don't see in the newspapers about banquets and balls. You start to see things about purchasing guns, storing ammunition, training exercises, drilling exercises. So the whole sort of tone of the clubs begins to change. By August 74, you have the first serious armed clashes. In August, there's a bloody firefight in Georgetown, another mass attack in Rich Springs. In Edgefield, in late August, a series of deadly clashes between the Sweetwater Sabre Club, a local militia unit. Hundreds of armed men are involved. Continued violence was only averted when an Army officer intervened and convinced the militia to hand in their weapons to the state. State Republicans grew so panicky with the '74 elections appearing that the Congressman Robert Wallace was actually talking about a war of races was going to begin. He had never seen such a condition of affairs before in this state. Murders, outrages are of a daily occurrence. The ones who led the Ku Klux are organizing and drilling again. Right? Clear connection between these different organizations. They're not different, that's the connection. Gun clubs were more pervasive, larger, far better organized, more overt than the Ku Klux had ever been. But the gun clubs in '73, '74, again, are acting without a clear, coherent political agenda. Okay? A lot of violence, but I would argue this violence is even less politically useful. Right? This violence is geared toward militia units, not toward political structures, not toward voters, not toward office holders. So once again, in the '74 election, Republicans again split. There was a lot of division. The Democratic Party, the conservatives in the state, although they're doing a lot of personal damage, don't offer a parallel hierarchy. They don't offer an alternative of any kind. And once again, South Carolinian Republicans managed to hold on to power. Now, as those of you know, that's not the story at the federal level. Okay? At the federal level, 74 and 75 ushers in a real sea change because Republicans lose control of Congress. And for the first time since the 1850s, the Democratic Party takes control. So the external landscape is beginning to shift. Right? These factors are what take us out of the PTO and move us into the fourth phase, mature insurgency. External support fading, internal division, right? And learning from mistakes. These paramilitary groups realizing that organization and terrorism aren't enough. There must be the offer of some sort of an alternative. So by 1875, it's clear that the new Republican governor, a guy by the name of Daniel Chamberlain, was at war. The thing is, he was at war with his own state. Right? He came in as a reform governor. He tried to purge a lot of the system of the so-called scalawags and carpetbaggers who were nepotistic urchins taking over the treasury. He really wanted to clean house. And for a brief window in late 75, there's a hope, perhaps, of some sort of conciliation. That hope dies at the end of December of 75. There occurs a series of judgeship elections. And when Chamberlain isn't present, the judgeship elections go to the state assembly. The assembly elects a number of people to these judgeships who are known as the most corrupt, venal Republicans in the state. In other words, the message that goes out from this simple act is this reformed governor is impotent. I mean, he can't control his own party. It's going to be business as usual in South Carolina. It's going to be business as usual in South Carolina. That act led to really a consolidated effort to begin a political organization. By December 27th, a mass rally was held in Charleston with former General James Conner opening it with a rousing declaration. The question is no longer, can you live here or not? The question is whether you can live at all. We have to either redeem this state or leave it. He called for organization, thorough, complete, over the entire state to sweep from power those who have betrayed the trust that was confided to them. The new year had newspapers bursting with reports of meetings, speeches, calls to form political action clubs, calls to form gun clubs, saber clubs. Organization is the watchword, declared the Spartanburg Herald. The author talked about a general uprising of the people who will no longer down at the bidding of this corrupt group. Rallies are held in Greenville, Spartanburg, Newbury, Marion, Sumter, Union counties. The Rock Hill Grange declared that the last southern state, one of the 13 that declared herself free 100 years earlier, will again be a white man's state. The Barnwell Sentinel pledged the 4th of July will find us armed and equipped for another great struggle, even as our forefathers were 100 years ago. And the statement about the 4th of July was just perfect, because it is the 4th of July where the real consolidating event occurs, and that is the Hamburg Massacre. A little hamlet near the Georgia border, a 4-day battle began between local gun clubs and the local militia. Men died on both sides. But the larger story was what didn't happen. Federal troops did not intervene. The Attorney General, in fact, ordered no arrests be made until after the 1876 election. State Republicans were impotent. Federal government seemed indifferent. State Democratic leaders acted fast. Held a state convention in the beginning of August. When they adjourned, they had achieved a unity of effort not seen during Reconstruction. For the first time, they will enter a political campaign, embarking basically on an insurgency with a well-developed, efficient military organization and a coherent, acceptable political alternative. The state convention nominated Wade Hampton III for governor, and every senior state position was offered to a very well-known Carolinian, every one of whom happened to have been a general. okay, in a Confederate army. This is where a mature insurgency emerges. Wade Hampton argued we can use force without violence. His lieutenants, people like Martin, Witherspoon, Gary, disagreed. You can use force and violence. Okay? All of these measures fell to the operational unit, and that was the gun club. Their purpose, according to the founder of the Charleston's Carolina Rifle Club, simple: quell the Negro and his carpetbag masters and regain political control of this state. Gun clubs even adopted a uniform. Some of you probably know the red flannel shirt. Started getting the name red shirts, okay, by the middle of the year. Governor's office claimed that by August, 240 gun clubs existed in the state. Senator Patterson claimed 60,000 whites were members of gun clubs. Alexander Haskell, who was actually the chairman of the Democratic State Central Committee, he testified that there were at least 300 or 400 clubs, at least that number in the state. Again, unlike the Ku Klux, these clubs were part of a much larger organizational structure, much more coherent, much more coordinated. Each club reported to either the upper division under Colonel Samuel Pickens or the lower division under Major Theodore Barker. Okay, these two divisions, in turn, reported to the state military command. It was under General James Conner. Just as an interesting sidelight, so James Conner is in command of the state's gun clubs. He is running for Attorney General, okay, in this election. Deadly altercations occurred in summer and fall. Rifle clubs lashed out against militia units and all centers of Republican activity. Charleston suffered the King Street riot in September. Democratic units seized a portion of the town. Ellington was torn by riots and attacks later in the month. Almost 50 blacks were left dead. In October, a militia unit in Cane Hoy was caught in a 3-day battle with local gun clubs. The brash, violent nature of this finally pushed President Grant out of his lethargy. In mid-October, he ordered the surge during the crackdown. Right? But to conservatives, the response by the federal government demonstrated the illegitimacy of the local government. The state government was incapable of securing the state. Okay, that by itself made it illegitimate. As the federal soldiers arrived, the insurgency, the gun clubs, adapted. What had been terrorist cells out murdering other people suddenly became celebratory democratic poster children supporting a political movement. Gun and saber clubs served as the glorious military escorts as candidate Hampton crisscrossed the state on his campaign. Right? Everywhere he went, he was met by hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of gun club members who paraded him around, took him through the county, and then paraded him on through the rallies and balls to the next county or the next seat where he'd be met by other gun clubs. As a Civil War historian, I think it's a riot to examine it because it really is kind of an interesting, mocking deja vu of a march through South Carolina that was held a few years earlier by a guy named Tecumseh Sherman. Back to Dr. Thomas's point, the message of Tecumseh Sherman in South Carolina, the message of Tecumseh Sherman in Georgia, or James Wilson in Mississippi and Alabama, or Sheridan in Virginia, the message is simple. You see your dead pigs, you see your burning house, you see your broken fences. You know, we can go further than that. You ain't seen nothing. Okay, this is just the beginning. Right? Hampton's point is the same. Okay, you see these thousands of armed guys marching through the streets, parading around, singing songs. This is just the beginning. We can go further. Okay, we have a power you cannot resist. State elections rarely garner the national importance that South Carolina's did. Controversial, very controversial campaign gave way to a controversial election. Initial numbers showed Democratic victory, with, of course, Republicans screaming foul because of Democratic tactics. The issue, of course, is larger than South Carolina. You know that the conflicting returns from South Carolina and from other states threw the 1876 presidential election into chaos. That's not my story here. Back in Columbia, immediately after the election, a standoff began. Okay? incumbent Republicans here in this city refusing to relinquish control, while Hampton and thousands of red shirts basically took up occupation of Columbia. The lame duck Grant administration ordered federal forces to remain in the state, but take no action whatsoever. There were squabbles. There was even sort of this haphazard Pride's Purge attempt in the assembly. Some little things did erupt, but by and large, Hampton, Gary, the red shirts, the gun clubs showed extraordinary patience. Okay? I'm sure they recognized any kind of explosion would work to probably the Republicans' benefit. Right? Dual governments ended up appearing. Okay? Chamberlain and the Republican Assembly facing off against Hampton and a Democratic State House, which organized just down the road. This is really telling, because now you don't just have the esoteric concept of a political parallel hierarchy, an offer of something else. What you actually have in 1876 in Columbia is a physical parallel hierarchy. There are two governments sitting side by side in this city. The second act of this Democratic State House, the first act was they elected Hampton governor. The second act was it issued a call for taxes. It requested taxpayers advance 10% of their annual taxes to collectors named by Hampton, called Starve Them Out policy. Okay? Money through late 1876, after the election in early 1877, came pouring in to Democratic, and only Democratic, tax collectors. Newspapers and town meetings were held, reminding whites, quote, "The state is at war. And if you pay Republican collectors, you are giving aid and comfort to the enemy." State Republicans appealed to Grant, who was now in the waning days of his presidency, and he saw the futility of the situation. Quote, "The whole army of the United States would be inadequate to enforce the authority of Governor Chamberlain. The people of the state have resolved not to resort to violence, but to adopt a mode of procedure much more formidable and effective than any armed demonstration. Unless Governor Chamberlain can compel the collection of taxes, it is useless for him to expect to maintain his authority." The largest Charleston newspaper rejoiced over the president's commentary and added that, quote, "The truest, highest test of authority under a popular government is the power to levy and collect taxes. The argument of the purse is more convincing than the logic of the sword." In this situation, Hampton controlled both. Historians, of course, continue to debate the presidential election of 1876. Republican nominee Rutherford B. Hayes succeeds Grant. As soon as he becomes president, he calls both Hampton and Chamberlain to Columbia. They met there on the 2nd of April. The next day, Hayes ordered all federal troops out of Columbia, take effect no later than noon on the 10th of April. Chamberlain and the Republicans had few options. They had no support from the federal government. They could call out the state militia, see what happened, or they can just ride it out, just have dual governments, just sit there and see what the status quo develops. We know what Chamberlain did. On April 10th, he wrote his farewell remarks. "The government of the United States abandons you. It deliberately withdraws from you its support, with full knowledge that the lawful government of this state will be speedily overthrown." Chamberlain admitted he was, quote, "defeated by insurrectionary forces too powerful to be resisted." When reviewing the course of Reconstruction and eventually redemption in South Carolina, one wonders why were they successful in 77 and not successful earlier? A lot of factors come into play: changing national scene, problems within the state Republican Party, stories that have been told and told and told many times. But I like to explore the evolution of the resistance. Conservative whites exhibited patience and ruthlessness, determination, adaptability. You know, to see the Ku Klux or the gun clubs as insurgent cells is accurate, but it is incomplete. Okay? Violence and terrorism are only successful when they are balanced with other less violent measures, and most important, when wedded to a larger political agenda.
And my focus is really as a military historian, and my question is, how effective was this as a military strategy or a counterinsurgency strategy carried out by a military force? In the March of 1871, Major Lewis Merrill received orders to proceed from the plains of Kansas with Company K of the 7th Cavalry and head for a small town in the northwestern part of South Carolina, then called Yorkville, today York. So here it was nearly 6 years after the end of the Civil War, and Merrill's instructions were vague but urgent. He was to exert all moral influence possible to put a halt to the wave of terror that had been unleashed against the African American population and white Republican office holders. He could use the troops under his command to assist civil authorities in making arrests, but beyond that, he could not employ force on his own except as a last resort, he was told. And then he could only use his troops to protect from mob violence civilians who had already taken shelter within his army camp. On his way east, Merrill stopped in Louisville to see his commander, General Alfred Terry. Terry was a lawyer, a graduate of Yale College, and Merrill told him frankly that all he knew about the Ku Klux outrages were what he'd read in the newspapers. The stories, Merrill said, seemed incredible on their face. There had been stories of midnight beatings and hangings, of black schoolhouses and churches burned, of 1,000 disguised men silently taking over an entire town, seizing 8 African American men from the jail and stringing them up. There was the story of an African American state senator pulled off a train in broad daylight and shot repeatedly by a Ku Klux gang, who then rode off and no one tried to stop them. And though the men were not disguised, all of the witnesses claimed that they had either not seen the men or not recognized them. There were stories of so complete a state of intimidation in some counties that every elected Republican official, white and black, had resigned their office under threat of death. Surely, Merrill went on, these stories must be enormous exaggerations. And General Terry replied, when you get to South Carolina, you will find that the half has not been told you. And so began Major Lewis Merrill's introduction to what would be 6 years waging one of the U.S. Army's first counterinsurgency and counterterrorism wars. Now, just to give you the larger context, from 1867 to 1877, more than 3,000 African Americans and their white Republican allies would be killed in terrorist violence in the South. Among them were at least 60 state officials and office holders, political leaders, who were assassinated in carefully planned killings. These included state senators, state representatives, county supervisors, judges, prosecutors, justices of the peace, sheriffs, constables, mayors. Several pro-Reconstruction Southern governors and members of Congress barely escaped assassination as well. And to those who fought what was, ultimately this losing struggle against this tide of violence, there was little doubt as to its political significance at the time. The war still exists in a very important phase here. General Adelbert Ames, the military governor of Mississippi, reported to General Sherman in 1869. And Ames went on to say the murders taking place were not the usual events of ordinary times. They were nothing less than an attempt by ex-Confederates to regain through terror and guerrilla warfare what had been lost at Appomattox. The political aims of this terrorist insurgency would become all the more manifest by the end of this 10-year period. By the time of the state elections of 1874 in Louisiana, 1875 in Mississippi, and 1876, as we just heard about in South Carolina, white paramilitary forces, by then typically well-mounted, heavily armed, often with the latest model of 16-shooter Winchester repeating rifles, which could fire 1 shot per second, far better weapons than the U.S. Army had, thoroughly drilled, sometimes uniformed, generally commanded by ex-Confederate officers, played a decisive role in ousting the Reconstruction governments, effectively ending black suffrage and securing white conservative home rule to the South for a century to come. Now, it's also, I think, important in the larger context to understand that, you know, in the history that would be written afterwards, you would hear a great deal about corruption as the reason for why, quote-unquote, redemption had to occur. But, you know, when you go back and read the words of these white conservative Southern leaders, as early as 1868, from the moment the first state constitutional conventions were called under the Reconstruction Acts, which were required to adopt new constitutions on the basis of universal male suffrage. From the very start, you see that the objection of the old white guard is not corruption, it's not anything black militias were doing, it was the fact that blacks were going to be voting, and particularly the sight of African American men carrying arms was in itself something that provoked fury. You read the newspapers, you read the accounts of the time. This was an insult to white honor, you see. This brought up all of the boogeymen of slave revolts. It wasn't anything these militias did in 1869 or 1871 or 1876 that was the issue. It was the mere fact of their existence. And I do just want to quote too. This is 1868. This is the Democratic Party State Central Executive Committee in South Carolina. Excuse me. This is before any Reconstruction legislature has met, before any charges of corruption could even arise. And they're protesting against the adoption of the Constitution. And they said that Constitution enfranchises every male Negro over the age of 21. The Negro being in a large numerical majority as compared with the whites, the effect is that the new Constitution establishes in this state Negro supremacy with all its train of countless evil. A superior race is put under the rule of an inferior race. And then they went on to say, we do not mean to threaten resistance by arms, which of course means we do mean to threaten resistance by arms. It says, but the white people of our state will never quietly submit to Negro rule. This is a duty we owe to the land that is ours and to the proud Caucasian race whose sovereignty on earth God has ordained. Well, the success and failure of the Reconstruction program, of protecting the freedmen from violence and economic exploitation, breaking the political monopoly of the old planter aristocracy, modernizing the southern states' educational, legal, and tax systems, of course, was a complex product of national and local politics, economic forces, constitutional law issues, many other factors. But it was also very much dependent on the outcome of this military struggle on this unconventional battlefield. When supported by mobile tactics, good intelligence, a shrewd application of psychological warfare, the U.S. Army achieved some significant initial victories that were instrumental, I would argue, in advancing the political goals of Reconstruction in the period of 1871 and 1872. Likewise, when hampered by hesitant generalship, a lack of cavalry for mobility, loss of military initiative, the counterterrorism effort foundered. And white conservative paramilitaries, as we just heard about, unleashed the resurgent wave of murder and intimidation that ultimately brought the fight to a decisive end by 1877. Now, Lewis Merrill was arguably one of the most successful and most clear-sighted of the Army officers who fought this counterinsurgency war. From a modern perspective, it's striking to me how many of the issues Merrill faced and the solutions he conceived would anticipate the insurgency and counterinsurgency wars of the 20th and 21st centuries. One of the most striking things about Lewis Merrill's approach upon his arrival in Yorkville in March 1871 was how well he grasped the political and psychological dimensions of the military challenge that he faced. And he did quickly discover, as General Terry had warned him, that the reality was indeed far worse than he had imagined. Merrill began compiling meticulous files, soon accumulated evidence of 400 whippings and beatings, and 6 murders in Yorkville and the surrounding parts of York County. He discovered quickly that most of the leading whites of the county were participants and ringleaders in the Ku Klux outrages, and he realized too that any action he took not only had to be militarily effective, but had to be seen as legitimate. Now, Merrill had an unusual background that helped prepare him for this kind of political military warfare. During the Civil War, he had raised his own volunteer cavalry regiment, Merrill's Horse, in Missouri. And early in the war, he was breveted brigadier general, was ordered to clear the rebel guerrillas out of the northeastern part of Missouri. The guerrillas were operating behind Union lines, robbing, kidnapping, murdering pro-Union civilians, often killing Union prisoners they captured. And Merrill tried arresting Confederate sympathizers. He arrested 1,500 of them, released them once they had sworn an oath of loyalty. And he later said, "I cannot point to one single instance in which they have faithfully kept their promise." So in September 1862, he convened a military commission, tried 22 rebel guerrillas who had committed particularly gruesome murders, all after having been arrested at least once on their released on their oath. And these 22 were convicted and sentenced to death. When a 70-year-old pro-Union civilian was kidnapped from the area, notice was given by the Union forces that unless he was released unharmed, 10 of the condemned men would be executed at once. The abducted man was murdered, and 10 of the prisoners were shot by firing squads. Now, the men of the surrounding communities, whom Merrill believed to be the secret leaders of the guerrilla bands, the haven't-done-nothing men, he called them, who always managed to escape arrest and punishment himself, Merrill ordered banished from the region. And after that, northeastern Missouri became considerably more tranquil. But the necessity of penetrating the surface of this insurgency and finding the power behind it was a key lesson Merrill would take away with him. And in this kind of war, Merrill learned to use spies and subterfuge, as well as the more orthodox cavalry tactics he learned as a cadet and second lieutenant at West Point and Fort Riley. He learned to doubt suspected Confederate deserters who had come into his own lines with tales to tell. One time he had the officers of his staff befriend a Confederate prisoner and get him drunk to get him talking the truth. So when he arrived in Yorkville in 1871, one of the first things Merrill did was to start spending money quietly to recruit informers. And then he summoned the leading citizens of the town to a meeting, and he described in minute detail recent Ku Klux raids, making it clear that they could do nothing without him learning of it, implying strongly that there were informers in their own ranks, so they would begin to start doubting one another. He expressed gentle amusement when one of the local men asked for the names of the guilty parties so that they might see them brought to justice themselves. The major said he was sure the names were as well known to them as they were to him, and he said he could have them arrested himself within the hour if authority were given to him. Now, that would prove an important psychological gambit, and it impresses me that even without using any military force whatsoever, Merrill at once sought to alter the dynamic of the situation, to seize the initiative in this way through the use of good intelligence and adroit psychological warfare. And of course, this is one of those intangible but terribly important factors in any military success, forcing the enemy to react to you rather than always to be the one yourself reacting to the enemy. Merrill spent several subsequent months patiently laying the groundwork to demonstrate that the local courts, still controlled by white conservatives, were totally unwilling and incapable of halting the violence. He would turn over evidence to the local court, swear out affidavits himself, and publicize the subsequent attempts by the prosecutor and judge to secretly pressure him to drop the cases. Merrill also faced new challenges, notably a large number of desertions from his own ranks, all but openly encouraged and abetted by the local white population, who would hide and assist deserters and who were always happy to keep the troops well supplied with whiskey. The poor quality of troops and the lack of training for such a delicate mission is a constant theme that runs through Merrill's reports from Yorkville during this year. His decisive action came at the end of the year, and here again I think Merrill shrewdly played the psychological and propaganda angles. When presidential authority to make the arrest finally did come in November 1871, Merrill used his cavalry to ensure not only that the scores of arrests could be made nearly simultaneously the same day before word could spread, but also that it would be done in broad daylight, seizing the wanted men in town or at their places of business, and thus preempting any accusations of men being torn from their families with a knock on the door in the middle of the night, which were the sort of standard bugbear of American notions of despotic regimes and what they did. Now, the Attorney General of the United States at the time, Amos Ackerman, had worked closely with Merrill on coordinating the arrests, and Ackerman visited Yorkville in November 1871. He wrote General Terry afterwards, "All that you said to me about Major Merrill I found to be true. He's just the man for the work. Resolute, collected, bold and prudent, with a good legal mind, very discriminating between truth and falsehood, very indignant at wrong, and yet master of his indignation. The safer because incredulous at the outset, and therefore disposed to scrutinize remarks the more keenly. He has performed a difficult service with admirable success." But Ackerman and Terry were both keenly aware that success depended on more than anything military action by itself could accomplish. Manifestly, military power alone is not sufficient to meet the emergency, Terry wrote. Terry said all the troops of the Army would be insufficient to provide protection throughout the South to those threatened by the Ku Klux. What he argued, and what Ackerman argued, was that what was needed was exemplary punishment of a few of the key leaders. But as we've heard, the federal courts were indeed overloaded far beyond their capacity to handle the hundreds of men charged. And President Grant's subsequent policies of leniency and pardons, swift withdrawal of troops from Yorkville as part of the president's wishful policy of trying to return things to normality as soon as possible, further undermined the gains achieved. And the fact of the pardons actually had an enormous effect on attitudes. There was a sense that that was a sign that all of this effort didn't really had to be taken seriously any longer, that the federal government's heart wasn't really in this. Now, during 1871, the period I've just been describing, there were 8 companies of the 7th Cavalry, about 400 men in all, ultimately sent to South Carolina. They joined about 500 infantry troops already in the state, about 900 troops at the peak. The contrast with 1876, when again the state government faced a resurgent white terrorist threat, would be painfully evident. In the fall of 1876, there were again at the peak about 1,000 U.S. troops in the state, none of them cavalry this time. That in itself caused a huge loss of initiative, for even when there was the will to intervene, to halt violence, U.S. troops had to march by foot, often against well-mounted white rifle clubs. In the case of the Ellenton Massacre in October 1876, a detachment of the 18th Infantry did arrive in time to prevent what would have certainly been a wholesale slaughter of several hundred black state militiamen who'd been surrounded by white rifle clubs, but many had already been killed in the preceding days before the U.S. troops could intervene, before they could even arrive there on the scene. Moreover, there was no one with the initiative of Lewis Merrill on the scene at that time among the U.S. Army commanders. Local U.S. Army commanders then, in 1876, interpreted their orders very narrowly to mean that they could only act to halt bloodshed once it had begun, not to preempt it, which placed the Army in the position of passively allowing the rifle clubs to strike when and where they chose. No attempt was made to infiltrate the clubs or to disarm them. And this loss of initiative was probably the most crippling blow to any hopes for quelling the insurgency. Propaganda about federal bayonets interfering in the election so cowed the U.S. Army commanders that they mostly ordered their troops to stay away from polling places altogether on election day. And in places like Edgefield County, where many of the polls were literally commandeered by the armed white rifle clubs who turned away black voters. As even one conservative white historian wrote in the 1920s, the election of 1876 in South Carolina was, quote, little more than a ratification of the seizure of power by the rifle clubs in the previous months. Now, Lewis Merrill again found himself fighting a similar losing battle against the so-called White Leagues in Louisiana in 1874. Again, hamstrung by restrictive rules of engagement, vastly outnumbered, short of cavalry, forced on the defensive. And there was also the fact that he was constantly, and in fact anybody in the U.S. Army who wanted to play this role, was facing the fact that this was not warfare as most military men of that time certainly understood it. Most of the Army officers would much rather have been back out west fighting the Indians rather than engaging in what they derisively termed constabulary duty. And the Army itself was eager to put the entire episode behind them once Reconstruction came to the end. And one is hard-pressed even today to find more than a half a sentence in most regimental histories. If you look at the 7th Cavalry's regimental history, it's half a line about constabulary duty in this period. It's only been with the benefit of more recent history that I think it's possible for us to grasp what people like Lewis Merrill grasped at the time, that this was war, but war fought with very different rules. And in particular, the very ways in which the violence was disguised or played down by its perpetrators was a calculated part of its political purpose and effectiveness. Recent studies of insurgency have pointed out that one of its key characteristics is that this kind of warfare is inevitably conditioned by negative as well as positive objectives. Now, negative objections, by definition, can be achieved only by restraining or limiting the use of military force. And clearly, the principal negative goal of white Southern conservatives in South Carolina and in other states as well, was to avoid any steps that would cross the line of provoking and politically justifying, in the eyes of the rest of the nation, a truly overwhelming military response by the federal government. They knew, of course, that they could not possibly prevail in an open, traditional military conflict. The positive objectives pursued by the white Southern terrorist groups likewise correspond to what, from a modern perspective, are easily recognized as classic terrorist methods, in that the response they sought to provoke was often as important or more important than the act itself. One basic aim of the Southern white terrorists was simply to demoralize their opponents and undermine their confidence in the ability of their own political leaders to offer them protection at the most basic level, their lives and property. At an equally basic level, random and sporadic acts of brutal terror were a form of blackmail that could be used to effectively pressure a more humane opponent to capitulate. The Republican Governor Daniel Chamberlain all but gave up attempting to conduct his campaign for re-election in South Carolina in 1876 after hundreds of Democrats repeatedly showed up at Republican political meetings, openly and heavily armed, demanding, quote, equal time to speak. And Chamberlain said, I yielded to them simply because I was not willing to take the responsibility of a massacre. And finally, by provoking Republican governors to call for federal troops for protection, which happened in South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, but by avoiding acts which would be so provocative as to trigger a truly crushing response, the instigators of terrorism achieved several purposes. They were able to portray the Republican governments as clinging to power only by being propped up by federal bayonets, that phrase that probably appeared 1,000 times in Southern Democratic newspapers of the day. They were able to add a sense of victimization in the South and tap into deeply felt American uneasiness over military involvement in domestic civilian affairs. They were able to increase the color line identity of the political parties, adding to the considerable social pressure that already was being exerted on native white Republicans, who, by the way, were the largest group in the Southern Republican parties at this time, to basically put racial allegiance ahead of political allegiance. And they were, interestingly too, able to delegitimize the state governments on the national level, quite ironically, but by saying that they were weak and ineffective. Look, this government is incapable of maintaining domestic order. Never mind that we ourselves are the ones committing the breaches against domestic order. But you see in this period the conservative Southern representatives in Congress making this argument again and again. They referred to these imbecile governments, the so-called Reconstruction governments that are incapable of maintaining order. Well, if Reconstruction became a forgotten chapter for a long time in the U.S. Army's history of counterinsurgency warfare, I should add that it was only one among several from this era. The same attitude of forgetfulness was evidenced toward the U.S. Army's lessons of the Mexican-American War, the military government of California before statehood, two other early instances in which the U.S. Army was called to perform civilian duties. In neither case were the Army occupation commanders asked to prepare any kind of manual from their experiences, and there are often quite invaluable innovations in occupation and military government largely vanished from the U.S. Army's history. And some of these lessons that they learned would have to be reinvented when the U.S. Army was in the Philippines in the early years of the 20th century, again in World War II in certain theaters, and arguably even again today. Well, thank you very much.